I always looked at discounting in general as a cocaine-laced crutch. It works, right? Until it doesn't, right? People get hooked on it.
I was talking to a sales rep today who's like, hey, I feel like this person's going dark on me. I said, well, yeah, maybe they are, because they've realized that that's a way to get you to come to the table and offer a concession.
The better you are at that alignment, that value selling, the sort of making sure that you're selling the right value to the right customer or the right prospect, then you probably have to lean less on negotiation.
When you lack this discipline, when you, everything from your marketing to your sales approach, when there's exaggerations, when there's, maybe very fluffy ROI numbers, when you are forcing the buyer to kind of haggle with you to get the best price, all of that erodes trust. It's not a partnership at this point. It's a very arm's length transaction where we are both incentivized to optimize for ourselves.
Yo, mic check. What's up, everybody? You're listening to the Street Pricing Podcast, the only show where proven SaaS leaders share their mindset and mistakes in pricing so we can all stop guessing and start growing. Enjoy, subscribe, and tell a friend. Now, let's break it down with your host and sought-after slayer of bad pricing, Marcos Rivera.
What's up and welcome to the Street Pricing Podcast. I'm Marcos Rivera, CEO of Pricing.io. Today's guest is Michael Shields. He's the Vice President of Procurement at Tropic. Michael, welcome to the show, man.
Hey, Marcos, thanks for being here. Love your book. Love this idea of pricing. I have a lot of opinions about it, so it'll be fun to chat about this today. From my vantage point, I think a little bit of a unique vantage point of being a procurement guy who, has bought a lot of SaaS over the years.
I don't get the perspective of procurement enough, in my opinion, man. So I'm excited to hear your point of view. Real quick for the audience, just give them a little quick about you and what you do.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, so all I've ever done is procurement, going on 17 years now. Started in the world of manufacturing, but about 9 years ago, started in tech, started in SaaS, and what I realized is those industries are very, very different. I remember buying parts for like aircraft engines or space satellites, and you could really come down to like what a price should cost, because you could calculate the labor, the materials, and then you could add a gross margin. You could come up with a should cost analysis. And then I moved to the world of tech where, hey, what is the cost of a license? And it's a very arbitrary number. There's the cost to cover your variable costs, which, by the way, variable costs are pretty minimal. And then you have all these big like R&D, fixed costs, that sort of a thing. But anyway, so right. I've kind of carved out a niche for myself as being the procurement guy for tech companies, covering all sorts of spend, but certainly looking at a lot of SaaS.
Oh, yeah. And the one pushing back on the pricing, you are the boogeyman in all these AEs' minds, right? Like, how do I get past procurement? How do I get get this thing signed? So this is going to be a lot of fun to unpack, man. Are you ready to get street with me?
I'm ready. The boogeyman's ready.
Listen up, everybody. Quick roadmap for y'all. This show is based on the book Street Pricing, right? And in my book, I have lots of stories, playbooks, things like that. But today I want to really dig into what I view as an obstacle to capturing value for a lot of SaaS leaders out there, right? And we're talking about price variability, price transparency, right? If you ever wonder, hey, am I paying a fair price? Am I paying what the other guy is paying for the same thing? On the other side of that, discounting and that discounting discipline. And whenever I see a lot of variability in price, meaning you're charging a whole lot of different prices for the same thing, that's usually a big red flag in my mind for a lot of reasons. But in your seat, Michael, you've seen a lot of price points come your way. You've seen a lot of deals discounting. I would like to start off with just tell me what you're seeing out there, man.
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting, right? Because, first and foremost, I think there's this perception that you do not pay list price for SaaS. You do not pay, there's this, if I'm the boogeyman, and I would love to throw off that image, of course, but like, it's essentially because I've been trained in this notion. Like, there is this notion out here, especially in SaaS, that the harder you push, the better price you get. And think about that. Like, if you are a go-to-market leader, what do you want? You want, as little negotiation as possible. You want to focus on value, and you want to focus on getting the solution in the hands of the right people. And by the way, the buyers want that too. It's like, hey, let's find the right solution and let's go. But unfortunately, pricing's important. What you spend is important. Right now, money is no longer free, right? And so we know that, hey, there is variability oftentimes, not all the way, not all the time, by the way. Sometimes you can push, you're not going to get anywhere. But then sometimes you can get a 50, 60, 85% discount, right? And so what's really interesting is there's a lot of non-value work required on both sides, which means buying cycles become longer, which means I was talking to a sales rep today who's like, hey, I feel like this person's going dark on me. I said, well, yeah, maybe they are, because they've realized that that's a way to get you to come to the table and offer a concession, right? And I think that there's a better way, Marcos. And here's one last thing I'll say is that for a long time, the pricing was unknown. My job was to get on a phone with a salesperson and try to assess how much flexibility existed. Maybe I might call up a buddy and be like, hey, Marcos, like this, I'm thinking about buying the solution. Do you use them? How much are you paying? You maybe have one data point.
Yep.
Now that's changing. Whether you like it or not, pricing transparency is going to increase. Whether the seller proactively makes it more transparent or the buyer has access to more data than they've ever had before. And so they probably know what is possible. And when they see a proposal from you, they're like, how do I get this down? And then it becomes this non-value added, painful negotiation.
There's a lot to unpack there, especially the non-value added pieces, the variability, the push to get the one data point now turning into multiple data points. There's a lot in there. A couple of things. Let's start off with just putting yourself in the seat of a SaaS leader. Let's say that you're trying to hit quota, you're trying to hit sales. Oftentimes, especially towards the end of the quarter, you'll start seeing this behavior like from the reps, like trying to hit that number for the quarter or for the end of the year. They'll start giving the concessions. And so procurement folks, stop me if I'm wrong here, because I'm just throwing this out here. Procurement folks start to pick up on that, and they'll ghost you, like you were saying a minute ago, kind of wait towards that, end of quarter time frame or end of year time frame in hopes that you'll come back with a concession or a better price and things like that. And so there seems to be on both sides, everyone knows the game, right? Like who's more desperate, who's more motivated to sell or buy in that struggle. What do you say to maybe both sides of the table? What do you say to the seller in terms of how do you mitigate a lot of that and not fall for that trap? What do you also say to the buyer so they make sure they get a fair deal?
Yeah, this is a really tricky one. It's a hockey stick phenomenon. If you've seen like the percentage of deals that are signed the last week, the last 2 weeks of a quarter can be as high as 80, 90%. So what that means is like if there's, 12 weeks in a quarter, the first 10 weeks, no deals are coming through. Those InfoSec resources, those legal resources, those deal desk resources. I'm not just saying they're sitting around, but like it's kind of a fixed cost, capacity model. And yet you're putting this massive strain because you're exactly right. We have been trained. In fact, it's exacerbated when 9 out of 10 SaaS deals I work on, you do the demo, you get to the pricing stage, and they are the ones who bring it up. They say, hey, here's your pricing. And oh, by the way, it's contingent upon signing by the end of the quarter. It doesn't matter. Like if you were thinking you were going to buy a month from now or 2 months from now, there's this pressure. Well, the buyer hears that and they say, oh, wow, Marcos really wants to close this by the end of the quarter. And then they're like, I wonder what else I can get from that. So even though the seller was trying to put the urgency on the buyer, a lot of times the buyer will turn it back and weaponize it on the seller, if that makes sense. But yeah, so it's this big artificial and inefficient method. And so I really think that, we need to kind of move away from that in general. I think here's a very high level solution that we can break it down, but you need to balance the short-term victories versus the long-term aspect, right? Because when a buyer knows that, hey, they want to close it in the end of the quarter, you are going to end up having to get concessions that you maybe would not have otherwise done if you would have been okay closing it the first couple weeks of the next quarter. Does that make sense? And so, and now in the spirit of transparency, other buyers are going to find out about that. And then, so now they're going to expect those same level of discounts. And so that really erodes the integrity of the pricing that you probably set up and said, hey, this is the pricing model we need to support our business, but now our average price is down here.
Damn. I mean, listen, this is a very common playbook that a lot of sales folks use, right? They'll say the end of quarter signature thing. And what they're doing is they're trying to create urgency. So the company, buys. And there's other ways to create urgency with priority in the queue and launch and reminding them the cost of doing nothing and things like that. But when you start introducing, say, a discount for end of the quarter or to drive that, what you're showing them is a wet towel. All right. And when people see a wet towel, they squeeze it, right, to get water out. And if they think there's water in there, they're just going to keep squeezing. You've done that before, right? You've squeezed wet clothes, wet towel, whatever. And it's like, I think there's some more water in here. Let me squeeze it again. But if you can show a dry towel where it's like, look, this is what it is. These are the terms. These are the parameters. Then there's less likelihood that they'll try to squeeze. Is this crazy talk? Or you're like, no, Marcos, I think there's something there.
No, that is exactly right. And in fact, some companies, Marcos, are doing this correctly. Okay. So Tropic, put out a report. It was pricing variability for top suppliers, normalized for volume, everything like that for the first half of 2025. And they're, a company like, Datadog, like the pricing variability, the line's almost touched, meaning like, they're not making these interesting concessions. I haven't seen obviously what their revenue model looks like, but I'm guessing it's not a hockey stick. My guess is it's very consistent, very efficient, that sort of a thing, which is great. And then there's other ones where the line is anywhere from negative 50% to 62%. I mean, that line is massive, right? And so to your, squeezing analogy, that's the buyer squeezed, water came out. They squeeze again, water came out. And all of a sudden they're like, whoa, there's savings to be had here. There's, opportunity to be had here. And they're just going to push, which is really interesting because as a seller, you might think that like there's a lot of negotiation strategy that comes into play. But, if I'm buying something from you and I'm like, hey, Marcos, like I hear what you're saying. Like, you quote me $1,200, like I can pay $800. That's my budget is. And you're like, okay. And all of a sudden like, oh, interesting. Like, okay, one more thing, right? Whereas if you're to say, hey, unfortunately I can't, here's why, I can do $1,100, but it's once again, this, we have the resources set aside for implementation. So I can only do that if you're ready to go next week, because that way we can get you up live and going there, that sort of a thing. All of a sudden I feel like, oh, okay, like I asked for this. He responded here. There's not any more, it's like a dry towel here, especially because there's this contingency that benefits me and I can move forward there. Right. So I do think that there's a lot of signals. Once again, you can call me the boogeyman, that's fine. But once again, you kind of created the monster, right? And we're doing it because we've been trained that it works.
I think that's exactly the case here, is that the sales reps are creating the monster they're fighting. They're creating the boogeyman and then having to do all these, unnatural things to try to get a deal done. It hurts economics in the long term. It makes winning more expensive. It creates a lot of variability and misaligned expectations for the implementation people and the onboarding. And there's a lot of really poor downstream effects. Yeah, you do hit the quota, but then there's this sort of payment of terms you have to do afterwards in doing that. So for me, sometimes I think quota makes crazy behavior. And if you don't have the right guardrails and discipline behind the scenes, then you run into trouble. So a couple of things that I've seen out there that works, and tell me if you've seen this come across your desk on the procurement side, is discounts that are already predefined and baked in. So for example, hey, if you sign up for a longer term, from month to month to annual or whatever, we're going to give you discount. The old fashioned volume ones, right? Hey, you get 1,000 credits or you get 100,000 credits. You're going to get a nice break on the unit price if you buy and commit to a lot more. Another one here is if you do a specific bundle. Hey, if you buy these products A and B, we're actually going to give you a nice break in buying both of those together, right? So those are some of the things where it's baked, it's understood. There's sort of this kind of give, get, or reward mechanism of saying, hey, look, I want this behavior, multi-products, longer terms, more volume, and I'm going to reward for that in my discounting structure. But a lot of the sort of, fly by night, hey, I'll give you 25% off if you sign tonight, and all these kind of weird things, you want to keep those to a minimum. So
Yeah.
structured discounts versus not. What do you think of that? Crazy?
And well, what you're describing, that's exactly right. Because what you're describing optionality, which absolutely should be a good thing, not flexibility. And there's a big difference between those two things, right?
Oh,
Optionality is very logical. It's very data driven. It's like, hey, obviously if you're going to buy 10 licenses versus 1,000 licenses, there can be a discount there, right? If you're going to commit to a 3-year versus a 1-year, obviously there could be a discount there. If you're buying multiple SKUs versus one SKU, very much a logical discount there. The flexibility is where you get into trouble, right? Because then it's like, hey, you quoted me this price for this dollar amount. I'm asking for that same quantity. I'm not changing any variables. All I'm asking for is the price to change. And that flexibility is where, companies start to get into trouble. But keep in mind that once again, I believe that a lot of times the pricing is there, meaning the company has said, hey, yeah, here are the levers you can pull. But what's lacking is two things, Marcos. What's lacking is the discipline, meaning the enforcement of it, because you get a rep or you get a buyer who creates the perception, whether it's perception or reality, that, hey, you might lose this deal unless you do concede here. So that discipline is often missing. And then in the name of hitting a number or hitting a quota, you make that concession. But once again, you may have saved that deal, but it's like chopping off the head of a monster, right? Then you may have really impacted the trust and credibility of your pricing model. So that's number one, is like, how do you have that pricing discipline in place? And sometimes, yes, Marcos, that will mean you need to walk away or be willing to walk away from maybe a bad deal or a deal where you haven't fully shown the value. Okay. The other piece of the component is truly an enablement piece. You do the numbers, Marcos, of like, I don't know if you get involved in this in your world, but how many cold calls, emails, webinars you need to take to fill the top of the funnel, right? And then you make 1,000 calls, you maybe get like 20 connects, right? And of those 20 connects, maybe you get like 10 meetings, okay? And maybe of those 10 meetings, 3 make it to the proposal stage where there's like genuine interest, right? And let's just say it's a $100,000 deal. And then in negotiation, because you lack the pricing discipline and because you lack the enablement of truly helping the buyers see the value, you end up conceding to say $50,000, right? In that last stage where you have a buyer excited, you've given up half the value. And now think about everything else that needs to go back to occur to fill that value that you gave up. And so my point here's kind of the point I'm making, is a lot of times buyers will have a concern, an objection, and that problem will be solved via a discount. But a lot of times that problem can be solved via addressing the value proposition or things of that nature, helping the buyers see that these two products are not the same. But it's easier sometimes for both to go with the discount. But so anyway, what's missing is that enablement piece. The discipline and the enablement need to complement, be aligned with the pricing strategy.
The discipline and the enablement. And by the way, I've never heard this optionality or this optional versus flexible thing. That's a really interesting point. People use them interchangeably, but they're not quite the same thing. And I think that's really interesting that you split it that way. Hey, team, I want to take a quick pause here to ask for a small favor. This show is about helping entrepreneurs remove the guesswork and price with confidence. And it will be a huge help if you can rate the show and share it with a friend who you think is struggling with pricing. It takes about 10 seconds of your time, but it will mean the world to me. Thanks in advance. Now back to the show. Putting yourself in the shoes, thinking about a SaaS, founder or a CRO of a big SaaS company listening to this, figuring out like, ooh, yeah, we do sell most of our deals at the last 2 weeks of the quarter. We do end up giving away a bunch of these random discounts. I might have a discipline problem. I might have an enablement problem. What are some quick tips for them to maybe quick diagnose themselves, or maybe some tactical things they can do to help them out of this? Because I feel like there's more than one SaaS company that falls into this trap, and they probably want to know, how the hell do I get out of it?
I'd say there's a majority of them that fall into the trap. I do think there are creative ways to look at comp. I think that is absolutely, because incentives drive behaviors. Does that make sense? I talked to one CRO who had a very interesting a spiff strategy to where they massively incentivize their sales reps to close a certain percent of the deals in the first month of the quarter and the second month of the quarter. And if their deal cycle and close rate was, and they had it all measured out, but was more not a hockey stick, let's put it that way, they benefited from that. Of course, the company benefited as well too, right? And so it was placing less of an urgency on the end of the quarter and more kind of level setting that. I think that's really, really important. I do think it's from an optionality perspective, you need to really look at, hey, what options can we offer from like a SKU perspective? I think that's really important, because if you are trying to sell a premium solution to a buyer that doesn't have that need, then you're going to have to end up discounting a premium solution. So how can you sell a more basic solution to kind of meet their needs? So I think that that's kind of a part of it as well. But you should do a little bit of math, right? So the customer acquisition cost, CAC, for a company, I've seen it sometimes 14 months, sometimes 18 months, like sometimes in that area. Okay. A lot of times the average term length might be 12 to 14 months for that initial deal. And then churn might, maybe your renewal rate might be like 70, 80%. So that means 20 to 30% of your customers never generate profit for you, which is kind of crazy, right? And so is there a way to, try to de-incentivize kind of chasing maybe those bad deals or those bad fits? So yeah, I do think like comp plans, very important to kind of look at. But then once again, on the enablement side, I don't see near as much investment in training, in negotiation training, in value planning, things of that nature. I think negotiations and concessions should be a secondary effort only when potentially like the value proposition isn't quite there yet. And I think that once again, it is a little bit of a numbers game and they're chasing that. So those are two ways I think you can continue to invest in.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point at the very end about the training, the negotiation training, value framing, value positioning, or value selling, a lot of people call. But something you just said that really jived with me, which is the better you are at that alignment, that value selling, the sort of making sure that you're selling the right value to the right customer or the right prospect, then you probably have to lean less on negotiation. And so I wonder if the better you are at just framing and aligning what they want, what you sell, and making sure that fits like super tight, you may have to lean less on this whole negotiating, trying to convince them, trying to pull all these different tactics to get them to believe. So that way you can then get to the price, close the deal, things like that. So there may be this opposite relationship between the better you are at value selling and negotiating. If you're great at one, you may not have to be as great on the other. Listen, if you have both, even better, right? You'll be a killer closer and always hit your quota. But I think that there's an interesting reliance on the other as a crutch. And I always looked at discounting in general as a cocaine-laced crutch. It works, right? Until it doesn't, right? But it works.
Cocaine-laced crutch.
It's hard to get off, man. People get hooked on it. But if you're rewarding that behavior, to go back to your comp comments, I think then the company starts to introduce, like the bad starts to outweigh the good is what I'm saying. And they have to sort of it gets harder to pull away from that because again, somebody who's on cocaine for 2 weeks versus 2 years, it's really hard to, get them off at 2 years, right? Let me get off the drug thing. Cause listen, everybody, I don't do cocaine. I don't, I don't snort any of that kind of stuff, but the analogy still stands because it works really well and it's hard to get off.
Real quick, there's a quote that comes to mind. It says, to resolve problems through negotiations is a very childish approach. And I don't know that I fully agree with the whole concept of that, but the reality is like easy. It's simple. It is a crutch, but oftentimes it's medication. It's masking an issue. You're not solving the true problem.
Masking the issue. I think that's the key, getting to the root, right? So when I go back to what we said, right, you're a CRO, you're listening to this thing. Number one, I think structuring in your discounts so they're very clear and transparent what is rewarded, multi-year, multi-product, again, volume, things like that. The second part about comp, I think, is a key one. So once you have structure, the carrot and sticks in place to reward the right behavior. I love the idea of, hey, I'm going to reward you for closing these deals earlier in the quarter. maybe there's some accelerator in the comp or whatever that is, because you got that 10 weeks of calm and then that 2 weeks of chaos at the end, right?
Yeah.
And so you want to reward them for closing sooner. I think that's a fantastic stick. Another one is maybe if you do give them some discount authority, maybe you give the AE, I don't know, 10% or whatever, but they don't use it. There could be also another reward for not discounting, right? And this is this whole notion of commissionable gross margin and being able to reward folks that aren't using that discounting lever as much, to make sure that they're going to do whatever it is that they can to optimize their revenue as an AE. And so if you give them an extra reward for not discounting, that oftentimes gets that bump. But that third one here about the enablement, the value, selling, and framing negotiations. So I've attended some of these trainings, and I think that some of them do a bang up job, right? And really get deep into what elements of value that customers care about and buy, what jobs they're trying to get done, and that ICP fit. And here's the ones that I think do it the best. The ones that do it the best, the product marketing, the product management people, like they're all in on that training. Yeah. And there's a very, very tight cohesion between what it is that they sell and why, and then what they build, what the company's really good at, and how that differentiates from the other options that are out there. And so when I see just some outside third party come in and do sales training versus when I see it internal and all those groups in product marketing, management, all those areas are aligned, I normally see a lot better outcomes in the latter.
Well, I think you're absolutely onto something, because a lot of times those trainings are good, and they're people sit there like, oh, that's really interesting, but then you don't see the execution of it. Okay. And I think that's a little bit of a gap. So here's what I really like is the CROs, I can guarantee you most of them have some sort of conversational intelligence, revenue intelligence. We use Gong, like they seem to be having a lot of success right now. That is a great way to not just get specifically involved on like individual deals, but to start to look at trends across the board. Does that make sense? And I think that is a powerful tool that didn't exist a few years ago, for to say, hey, we gave this big concession here. We're going to go do kind of a postmortem after the fact. And what could we have potentially done wrong, right? Or done differently. I think that was what I meant to say. And I don't think we see that enough. I love the idea of, having some sort of tiger team involved in, exploring like where this execution is lacking. Because from a comp perspective, by the way, you had a great idea of like, hey, much bigger accelerator, less of a discount, right? I also think that there should be more of a true walkaway price too. I don't think that exists a lot of times. It's like unwillingness to walk away. But on the execution side, you are exactly right. And so there needs to be a person at the organization, especially in a big organization, where they can be watching these calls, using AI, using these tools to find out. And you just look at the data. Okay, we made a big concession here. Like, should we have done that in hindsight? And then you can start to take that, use those as learnings, not to throw people on the bus, say, hey, here's what we saw. And then the training becomes cyclical, right? It becomes like training, go to the execution, measure, and then bring that back into training. And then you start to be able to enforce, you start to be able to kind of see where the gaps are, plug the holes, and it will change.
I think a lot of folks miss that loop that you just said, right? I think they just do one piece and then
it's a one-time thing. Yeah.
Yeah. One time and then let it fly. Right.
Yeah.
I think that makes a tremendous sense. I do want to get to a question that I've been dying to ask you the entire time you've been on this show. All right. I'm going to hold it off for a second. There is, I think just a one thing to remember for folks listening today, talking about all the gaps you just illuminated and what's happening. What is the one thing you want CROs to take away?
What is the one thing I want CROs to take away? Okay. Look, there's a term out there. I don't know who coined it. I did not coin it. Okay. I call it the trust dividend. Okay. So essentially, there is this notion that if a customer trusts you, if there is credibility, then you can charge more. Not just charge more, by the way, the sales process will be more efficient, right? Like if you trusted me and you wanted to buy something from me and you trusted that I was going to give you a good deal the first time, guess what? You're not going to go back and haggle with me and argue back and forth, because there's that trust element, right? You may not feel the need to go and look at other options because you're like, hey, I trust that Michael is selling me a solution that's going to, be a good fit for me. Does that make sense? When you lack this discipline, when you, everything from your marketing to your sales approach, when there's exaggerations, when there's, maybe very fluffy ROI numbers, when you are forcing the buyer to kind of haggle with you to get the best price, all of that erodes trust. All of that erodes credibility. And so then you kind of are reverting back to, it's not a partnership at this point. It's a very arm's length transaction where we are both incentivized to optimize for ourselves. Okay.
I love it.
And so I guess, like, how do you align the pricing, the enablement, the whole sales methodology in a way that kind of builds that trust, builds that credibility, and do it in a way that is unique to the buyer and in their language? Like, that to me is a big gap and a takeaway, because this transparency, like, if we come in full circle here, Marcos, this transparency, whether you want it or not, is only going to increase. So having that trust, that credibility, and that pricing discipline will be a competitive advantage and become increasingly more so in the very, very short future.
I subscribe to that fully. I think that trust, transparency is going to be key for a lot of companies out there. For those that may not realize all these actions they're taking, the last minute discounting, the heroics, actually erode trust and make things even harder over time. I fully subscribe to that. The second part of my question, the one I'm really dying to get to you, because you've been in procurement forever. I want to know, how did sales reps get you to say yes? Go back, think about it. Which were the best ones? How did it get you to say yes and not block the deal?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I definitely don't see myself as like the typical procurement guy who wants to block the deal. At the end of the day, once again, I need to know that they have the best interest of me and my stakeholders, and by the way, that'll benefit them too, right? It definitely benefits them. And so when they can show that they understand truly what we need and say, okay, like, here's what we've heard you say. Okay, here's how our solution meets up with that. Here's how it doesn't. Here's how we're going to overcome those challenges. Does that make sense? When they're pretty transparent with me about true optionality, and they're not like, all over the board, all of a sudden it becomes less of a me versus you and more of a, how do we kind of tackle this together? Does that make sense? But it has to be, in this world of AI, I think it's a little bit easier to do this, but how does it be about me as the buyer and my stakeholders, and less about you as the seller? Does that make sense?
That makes perfect sense. I think it's a very collaborative mindset too. And so, as the boogeyman, you're not as scary as people think. I think you just really do want to collaborate, get to good outcomes, be there and represent for your stakeholders, get a good deal. You don't like the friction, despite what they say, right? The friction, the pound of flesh, all those things that they say about the procurement folks. I think at the end of the day, they do want that partnership and that high trust and collaboration. It's just a much better way to do business in general. Right.
It is, but it's not always possible. It truly takes two, right? Because if I'm giving that like benefit of the doubt and trust to you, but like you're optimized for you, like I now realize, okay, I can't do that. And so I have to revert back to, it's a little bit of that prisoner's dilemma type thing, right? I have to revert back to kind of these old school taxes, because that's what I need in order to achieve, what is potentially possible. Right.
There. Amen to that. I mean, I fully subscribe to it. And I think in our journey with Boogeyman and cocaine and postmortems, a pretty dark episode overall, but a lot of fun. And I think, and listening to these things, I think could lead to more dollars for folks on both ends. So thank you for coming in and just sharing your perspective. I think we put in the show notes that graphic or that chart you were talking about, the report with the price variability. I think that's going to be a valuable tool. And I have one last question that's going to help humanize the boogeyman. Let's look. Michael's got nice hair. He's got a nice smile. He's not as bad as I make him out to be, right? For those listening, Michael, give me your favorite song, your favorite jam, the thing you could listen to over and over again. Tell me why.
Over and over again. Okay, well, so this may surprise you a little bit, and we were talking about this pre-show. Like you had a feeling of like what my favorite song
Yep.
would be, and I don't know if I have to kind of think about like, do I have truly a favorite song? But the truth is like, I'm gonna make sure I'm looking at your face as I tell you this, but I like musicals.
Oh, okay.
I do. Like, I like going to New York City. I like, being on going to Broadway. So like the songs that are probably the most powerful for me are from some of those musicals because there's a story behind it. There's a character behind it. And so because of that, they're very moving. Does that make sense? And so, I think about, some of, obviously Hamilton is amazing. We were just actually in New York and Hell's Kitchen, story of Alicia Keys, some amazing songs in it. There's a musical called Six about the six wives of Henry VIII. That's just phenomenal. But, I think, one of my favorite ones is Les Mis, right? And you think about like the story,
Les Misérables,
behind Les Mis, and there's just some really powerful music in there. So, but there's one in particular called Bring Him Home, which is just, you have to be in the right mood for it because it's not like this up and beat one, but like you really get into that, and it has so much powerful. But One Day More, Empty Chairs at Empty Tables, like that musical, very, very powerful.
Damn, that is Les Mis. I don't think anyone's ever brought that up here on the show, but I can see the reasoning behind it. I was way off, by the way. If you want me to tell,
what's funny? What's funny is like my wife is she boxes, and sometimes I go to the gym with her, and sometimes I imagine like if I were to ever like go into like an amateur boxing, like what would be my walkout song? I think it would probably be from a musical. I just have to decide like which one I can weave into a walkout theme.
Damn, that is a curveball for me. I had the Beastie Boys, by the way, just so you know.
Hey, there's some great. I love the Beastie Boys. Who doesn't love the Beastie Boys?
I threw it out there just for fun, man. Thank you for playing along, and would love to have you back here. You willing to come back and give us an update on what you're seeing?
Yeah, so fun, Marcus. Let's do it again.
Thanks.
Yeah,
thank you.
Got your book up on the shelf, waiting for version 2 to come out. In this world of AI, in this world of benchmarks and stuff like that, I do think I love your book, Marcos, and it's phenomenal. Definitely, I have notes, by the way, that I have like on page this, they say this, and I will reference back to those. But I'm excited. I don't know if it's on the works or not, but like I am definitely excited. I think the world needs street pricing volume 2.
Man, that is high praise, number one. Didn't expect this, but I will drop a teaser about the remix. Okay. And there is something in the works here. I won't reveal much yet because it's not done, but it's something in the works, man. Thank you for that. Major high five to you. Team, that was Michael Shields. He is at Tropic, and he sees all sorts of different trends around procurement, buying, selling, licensing, SaaS pricing products. Go follow him on LinkedIn. He dropped a lot of knowledge today and perspective, right? Beyond boogeymans and cocaine, lace crutches, and all those key things, right? But connecting those dots around your selling discipline, around the enablement, the training, the measurement, and making sure that you really have a system behind the sale, right? And that way you get better over time. Take what you learned, apply it, get 1% better, move away from that guesswork. And remember, stop guessing and start growing. Until next time.
Thank you and much love for listening to the Street Pricing Podcast with Marcos Rivera. We hope you enjoyed this episode, and don't forget to like and subscribe. If you want to learn more about capturing value, pick up a copy of Street Pricing on Amazon. Until next time.